You're probably starting to think about the last time you encountered science news. Typically, we learn about scientific findings secondhand, through the media or conversations with our friends and family. We're naturally curious about things that may have a direct impact on our health and well-being, or a late great scientific innovation. But there's a lot of information to keep up with. Even something as simple and as mundane as whether or not I should drink this cup of coffee. But we can make keeping up with science, all types of science, easier if we know a bit more about science media and ways to credibly evaluate information. Most of us depend on science media and reporters to tell us about big breakthroughs. And by science media, I'm thinking about the science section of the New York Times, Wired, The Economist, broadcast television or radio, all of where we may hear about science or encounter interviews with scientists. So it's worth asking, who decides what's media worthy? Well, that's the job of journalists and editors of science media. Let's listen to Amy Harmon, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, tell us what she thinks is a media-worthy science story.
My approach is maybe slightly different from many. I mean, I love to read the Science Times or to read sort of pieces that are kind of directly about science and that just sort of explain what the science is in terms that are evocative and nice writing and help to simplify and to convey concepts. My approach is to try to tell stories about it, to try to talk about science concepts, but through narratives that are about people. So I find that is one way, it's not the only way, but to sort of engage readers emotionally in a story about a protagonist who they come to care about, or maybe they like that person or maybe they dislike that person, but they're interested in what is going to happen at the end of the story. That's what I strive for in communicating about science.
And so what Amy is saying is pretty typical. She's looking for a good story, not just interesting science, because the media needs readers. And how far will the media go to tell a good story? Well, here's an example. In June 2015, a journalist named John Bohannon played an elaborate hoax to demonstrate the proliferation and lack of fact-checking that happens in science reporting. He fabricated a story about chocolate and weight loss that hundreds of popular publications picked up, though it's worth noting that some more serious science publications did not. But why did any news outlet pick this up? Well, pardon the pun, it was just too good to resist. And the story had a lot of secondary clues to make it seem credible. Words like scientific research study and using data to produce results. And it's important to get a sense of how science media works, but many of us don't encounter news directly from news sources. Often, we get our news filtered through social media like Facebook or Twitter. And let's listen to Nick Perkins, director of SciDevNet, an online news site dedicated to reporting global scientific innovations, talk about the role of social media and the increasingly crowded media landscape.
So SciDev uses a variety of formats to deliver its journalism. Not only text, but we use multimedia, including podcasts and data visualization packages. So it's all very exciting. Can we say that one of these formats or one medium works better than others? Not really, because I'll tell you what's really interesting is that actually we look at our audience across direct visits to the site, social media reach, and also we do a lot of republishing on other media outlets. And there are very few stories that do really well across all three, which is for us really interesting. And it underscores something that we have come to understand, which is that actually different audiences will engage with different stories in different ways. So, there's a great big difference between the way that audiences will view videos on Facebook compared to the way they do it on YouTube.
And so what Nick is saying about the proliferation of sources make it incredibly important for us to examine a source's credibility on a topic. We rely on secondary clues to help us sort out what's credible and what isn't, because it isn't reasonable that we will read first-hand accounts of science in peer-reviewed journals. After all, while they are available and we could, they're written in a pretty technical language and the primary audience is other experts. And so we need to rely on secondary clues for credibility, such as what's the source of the publication? Who is the author? Why are they qualified to write on the topic? What sources do they rely on to make their argument? Does either the author or the source have an obvious bias to make a strong claim? These questions go a long way in helping us evaluate the news, even if we don't know anything about the topic itself. because we don't need to be an expert to read the news. After all, the news is here to help us stay informed. But we should be critical evaluators of information, and we should feel comfortable questioning anyone, expert or otherwise, if something doesn't seem quite right. And there's one more layer I want to touch on, and that's our own inherent ways of looking at and adopting information. Information source trustworthiness is an important factor in information adoption, particularly in online communities. Higher levels of trust lead to higher knowledge exchange. And the extent to whether or not you trust information has a lot to do with your community. This is particularly important when it comes to social media. You're really trusting the person who shared the news first, and the quality of the news itself second. And researchers who've looked at why we trust in online communities tell us that individuals who are closer in social status or have a similar background are more likely to trust one another. And so this information can help us thinking about our own inherent biases when it comes to evaluating information.
Writing about science in general is challenging for a whole lot of reasons. And my biggest challenge, the thing that I'm really concerned about, is to try and make sure I understand my own biases, because everybody has biases. We all make decisions on things other than facts. And anyone who's read, Jonathan Haidt or Daniel Kahneman knows that we have this visceral decision-making apparatus, because humans evolved in an absence of data, but a presence of relationships and experience. And so, of course, our relationships and our experience are likely to drive our decisions, even though now that we do have data.
And so now we've thought a little bit more about the science media landscape. Who's giving us the news and why? We've identified key questions to help us critically evaluate information, and we've discussed how we take in information and trust what we are reading.